The autumn evening air had just begun to chill as Destiny Williams trudged down the cracked sidewalk of Maple Street, her fluorescent green grocery store vest still dusted with flour from restocking the baking aisle. Her shoulders ached from an 8-hour shift of bagging groceries and helping elderly customers to their cars, but she didn't mind the work since every dollar she earned went straight into her college fund jar at home, labeled Harvard Dreams in her own careful handwriting. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the familiar houses of her neighborhood, where Shed lived all 16 years of her life. Her feet moved automatically along the path Shed walked 1,000 times before, while her mind wandered to the calculus test Shed have to study for later that night when the first hints of something wrong tickled her nose. At first the scent was so faint she almost dismissed it as someone burning leaves in their backyard, a common enough occurrence in Cedar Grove during fall. But something about the smell made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It was sharper, more acrid than burning leaves, and carried with it an underlying scent of something else, something that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. Destiny rounded the corner past old Mr. Johnson's meticulously maintained rose bushes, and that's when she saw it, thick black smoke pouring from the windows of the beautiful Victorian house at number 247 Maple Street. Her heart stopped for a moment as recognition hit her like a physical blow. It was Mrs. Henderson's house, the same house where Shed spent countless afternoons over the years learning to bake snickerdoodles and listening to stories about the civil rights movement from someone who had lived through it. Mrs. Henderson had been more than just a neighbor to Destiny. She had been a grandmother figure in a town where Destiny and her family often felt like outsiders. The elderly woman had defended Destiny when she was accused of shoplifting in 5th grade by the drugstore owner, who had seen her picking up a prescription for her mother. She had attended every single one of Destiny's track meets, sitting in the bleachers with her signature floral hat, rain or shine, cheering louder than anyone else. Without conscious thought, Destiny dropped her backpack on the sidewalk, her calculus textbook spilling out forgotten. As the smell of smoke grew stronger and more threatening in the growing darkness, she could see orange flames beginning to lick at the edges of the lace curtains. Mrs. Henderson was so proud of the ones Shed brought with her from her mother's house in Georgia 50 years ago. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket, automatically dialing 911 while her eyes scanned the house desperately for any sign of movement. She knew Mrs. Henderson would be home at this hour. She always watched Wheel of Fortune at 6:30 while eating her dinner on the TV tray in her living room. It was part of her routine, as reliable as the sunrise. The operator was asking for details, but Destiny could barely focus on the words tumbling from her mouth as she saw the flames growing larger, spreading faster than seemed possible in the dry autumn air. She heard someone screaming in the distance and realized with a start that other neighbors were beginning to notice. 2 doors were opening up and down the street, faces appearing in windows, but no one was moving toward the house. No one was doing anything. That's when she heard it above the crackling of the flames and the distant wail of sirens, a sound that the world seemed to slow down around Destiny as Mrs. Henderson's cries echoed through the crackling air. Her track coach's words from countless practice sessions echoed in her mind. Focus, Williams, block everything else out, just like on race day. But this wasn't a race, this was life and death, and suddenly all those hours of training felt like preparation for this very moment. The kitchen window was partially open, steam rising from Mrs. Henderson's signature evening tea routine that Shed maintained for decades. Destiny could see the delicate china cup still sitting on the counter, inside probably still half full, growing cold. As chaos erupted around it, without hesitation, she sprinted across the lawn, her feet barely touching the frost-covered grass that crunched beneath her sneakers. Reaching the window, Destiny kicked off her shoes, remembering the fire safety video they watched in school about rubber soles melting in extreme heat. She pulled her grocery store vest over her face, creating a makeshift filter against the smoke that billowed out in thick, angry clouds. The window frame was hot against her palms as she pulled herself up, thanking whatever power above for all those pull-ups Coach Martinez had made her do. The heat inside the kitchen hit her like a physical wall, stealing her breath before she could even take one. Her eyes immediately began to water and sting, making it nearly impossible to see through the dense smoke that churned through the room like angry storm clouds. She dropped to the floor, remembering stay low, crawl below the smoke, another lesson from school that suddenly seemed vital. Somewhere above her head, flames danced across the ceiling, their orange glow casting shifting shadows that made everything seem surreal and dreamlike, except this was no dream. The linoleum floor burned against her palms as she crawled forward. The smoke was so thick she could barely see 2 feet in front of her face. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson, she called out, her voice sounding strange and muffled in the roaring air. A weak cough answered her from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by another cry, this one weaker than before. Destiny forced herself to move faster, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the voice in her head screaming at her to turn back. Get out, save yourself. She passed the living room, where the TV was still playing Wheel of Fortune, the contestants' voices eerily cheerful against the backdrop of disaster. The heat grew more intense as she approached Mrs. Henderson's bedroom, where the flames had already begun to consume the wallpaper, that familiar floral pattern curling and blackening before her eyes. She could make out a shape on the floor ahead. Mrs. Henderson had collapsed, still clutching something to her chest, her flowered nightgown standing out against the smoke-darkened floor. Destiny's muscles screamed in protest as she reached the elderly woman, feeling for a pulse. The way they'd learned in health class, relief flooded through her as she felt the flutter beneath her fingers. Mrs. Henderson was unconscious, but alive. The photo album she clutched was the one Destiny knew contained pictures of her late husband and children, irreplaceable memories that the elderly woman had often shared with her over cookies and tea. Get up, we have to move," Destiny urged, pulling at Mrs. Henderson's shoulders, trying to lift her without causing injury. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense, and she could hear the ominous creaking of wood under extreme stress above them. The ceiling groaned, a sound that sent primal fear shooting through her spine. Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Destiny managed to lift Mrs. Henderson into a firefighter's carry, another technique learned in school, though she'd never imagined actually using it. The journey back through the burning house felt like moving through a nightmare. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, fear, and the growing weakness in her smoke-filled lungs. She could no longer see the window she had entered through, having to navigate by memory and instinct alone. The flames had spread, blocking their original exit route, forcing them toward the front door, which seemed miles away through the inferno that the house had become. Sweat poured down Destiny's face, mixing with tears as she pushed forward, each step a victory against the growing certainty that they wouldn't make it. Her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, her muscles trembling with effort. But she refused to give up, refused to let go of the woman who had shown her nothing but kindness since the day they met. The sound of sirens growing closer felt like music to her ears as she finally reached the front door. The front door burst open with a thunderous crash as Destiny stumbled onto the porch, Mrs. Henderson still draped across her shoulders. The sudden rush of cool night air hit her smoke-filled lungs, causing her to gasp and nearly collapse. The weight of the elderly woman and the toll of the rescue finally catching up with her exhausted body. Neighbors who had gathered on the lawn surged forward, their faces a blur in Destiny's smoke-stained vision. Strong hands reached out to help, catching both Destiny and Mrs. Henderson as they sank to the ground. Red and blue lights painted the street in alternating colors as fire trucks and ambulances screamed to a stop, their sirens drowning out the shouts and chaos around them. Destiny tried to speak, to tell someone, anyone, about the photo album still clutched in Mrs. Henderson's grip, but her voice came out as nothing more than a hoarse whisper, her throat feeling like she had swallowed broken glass. Paramedics swarmed around them, their voices sharp and professional, cutting through the haze that seemed to envelope Destiny's mind. She felt someone press an oxygen mask to her face, the cool rush of air feeling like the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. Through the growing crowd, she could see the firefighters attacking the blaze, their powerful hoses sending arcs of water into the inferno that had once been Mrs. Henderson's beloved home. Destiny's mother burst through the crowd, her usual composed demeanor shattered by fear and worry. Baby, what were you thinking?" she sobbed, pulling Destiny into her arms while being careful not to dislodge the oxygen mask. Her father's strong presence appeared beside them, his hand gentle on her shoulder, while his voice shook with emotion, asking the paramedics rapid-fire questions about her condition. Through the chaos, Destiny kept her eyes fixed on Mrs. Henderson, watching as the medical team worked on her with swift efficiency. The elderly woman's face was covered in soot, her silver hair darkened with ash, but her chest rose and fell with steady breaths thanks to the oxygen mask they had placed over her face. The photo album lay beside her on the stretcher, somehow undamaged by the inferno, a small miracle in the midst of disaster. The decision to transport both of them to the hospital came quickly, the paramedics concerned about smoke inhalation and potential burns. Destiny tried to protest, wanting to stay and make sure Mrs. Henderson would be okay, but her voice still refused to work properly, and the world had started to spin in a concerning way that made her mother grip her hand even tighter as they loaded her into the ambulance. News cameras had already appeared, their bright lights adding to the surreal atmosphere as reporters pushed forward, trying to capture footage of the teenage hero and the woman she had saved. Destiny caught fragments of their questions. Who is she? How did she know? What made her go in? But the doors of the ambulance closed, shutting out their voices and the growing crowd of spectators. During the ride to Metro, General Destiny drifted in and out of awareness, the adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue finally fading, leaving behind in bone-deep exhaustion that made her eyes heavy. Her mother rode with her, speaking softly about how proud she was but also how scared, telling her never to do anything like that again, while simultaneously thanking God that she had the kind of daughter who would. In the moments when her mind cleared, Destiny caught glimpses of the paramedic monitoring her vitals, speaking into a radio updating the hospital about their arrival. She heard terms like smoke inhalation, possible respiratory damage, minor burns, but none of it seemed as important as knowing whether Mrs. Henderson would be okay. The elderly woman had been loaded into a separate ambulance, and Destiny strained to ask about her, but the words still wouldn't come. The last thing Destiny remembered before finally giving in to exhaustion was her mother's warm hand holding hers, the steady beep of medical equipment, and the distant wail of more sirens heading toward what remained of the house on Maple Street, where she had spent so many happy afternoons. She tried to focus on those memories, rather than the terror of the past hour, letting the gentle motion of the ambulance and the pure oxygen flowing into her lungs lull her into a fitful sleep, unaware that her act of heroism was about to spark a chain of events that would shake their small town to its core. The harsh fluorescent lights of Metro General Hospital cast strange shadows across the white walls of Destiny's room as morning light began to filter through the blinds. She had spent a restless night drifting between consciousness and uneasy dreams filled with flames and smoke. Her throat still felt raw and speaking remained painful, but the doctors had assured her family that there would be no permanent damage. Her mother had finally been convinced to go home and change clothes, promising to return with Destiny's favorite breakfast from the diner down the street. Her father had left for his early shift at the construction site after sitting vigil all night in the uncomfortable hospital chair, neither of them wanting to leave their daughter alone, but both needing to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the wake of such extraordinary events. The morning news played quietly on the small television mounted in the corner of the room. Destiny watched through heavy-lidded eyes as footage of the fire played on repeat. Local teen hero saves elderly neighbor. The caption read, showing shaky cell phone video of her emergence from the burning house. She could barely recognize herself in the footage. The figure in the video looked like someone else entirely, someone stronger, braver than she had ever imagined herself to be. A nurse had just finished checking her vitals, marking something on her chart with an encouraging smile when the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. Two figures appeared in the doorway, their presence somehow filling the small space with an immediate sense of authority. Detective Marcus Rogers and Detective Sarah Chen, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights as they stepped into the room, their faces set in identical masks of professional detachment. "Good morning, Miss Williams." Detective Rogers spoke, his voice carrying none of the warmth that title of hero shouldn't have earned. His tall frame seemed to loom over her hospital bed, while his partner moved to stand near the window, effectively blocking any potential exit. "Not that Destiny was in any condition to go anywhere. We need to ask you a few questions about last night's events." Destiny tried to sit up straighter, ignoring the wave of dizziness that accompanied the movement. She nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet, but eager to help piece together the timeline of the rescue for their investigation. But the next words out of Detective Rogers' mouth sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "Mrs. Henderson regained consciousness an hour ago," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "She reports that several valuable pieces of jewelry are missing from her bedroom, most notably her grandmother's sapphire necklace, a family heirloom worth approximately $50,000. She seems to remember someone going through her jewelry box during the rescue." The room seemed to tilt sideways as the implications of his words sank in. Destiny opened her mouth to protest, but Detective Chen cut her off with a raised hand. "We understand you were alone in the house with Mrs. Henderson for approximately 7 minutes before emergency services arrived, plenty of time to locate and pocket valuable items in the confusion." Tears burned Destiny's already irritated eyes as she shook her head, desperately trying to force words past her damaged throat. "I was saving her," she managed to croak out, the sound barely above a whisper. But Detective Rogers continued as if she hadn't spoken. "We have security camera footage from across the street showing you entering through the kitchen window rather than the front door, an unusual choice for someone attempting a rescue." Destiny's heart pounded against her ribs as panic began to set in. The same window that had seemed like the small holding cell at Cedar Grove Police Station felt like it was closing in on Destiny as she sat on the hard metal bench, still wearing her hospital gown beneath the paper-thin robe. Her mother had brought her. The events of the past 24 hours played through her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, hero to suspect in less time than it took to complete a school day. Outside her cell, she could hear the constant buzz of activity phones ringing, officers talking in hushed voices about her case, and a steady stream of reporters trying to get a statement from anyone who would talk. The story had exploded across social media, flooding local news feeds and even catching the attention of national outlets. The small town of Cedar Grove had never seen anything like it. Her parents stood at the front desk arguing with the booking officer, her mother's usually quiet voice rising with desperate emotion as she tried to explain how impossible these accusations were. Her father, normally the picture of calm strength, was visibly shaking as he held their daughter's bail paperwork. $15,000 might as well have been $15 million to a family living paycheck to paycheck. Through the station's front windows, Destiny could see two distinct crowds gathering on opposite sides of the street. One group hastily made signs declaring her innocence, bearing messages like "Free Destiny" and "Heroes don't steal," while the other crowd, darker in mood and intent, muttered about how they had always known something wasn't right about that Williams girl. Their signs carrying messages that made her stomach churn with their barely veiled racism. Her phone had been confiscated, but her mother had shown her the social media firestorm before being asked to put the device away. Facebook groups were splitting into factions. Nextdoor threads stretched hundreds of comments, long as neighbors who had lived beside each other for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological divide that had always simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town. Cedar Grove High School's unofficial Facebook page had become a battleground as students and parents argued about her character. Former teachers spoke out about her perfect attendance and honor roll status, while others questioned if her academic achievements had been earned fairly. The track team posted a photo of her breaking the state record in the 100-meter dash last spring, but the comments beneath it turned ugly quickly enough that the coaches had to disable them. The local news van had been parked outside her house since dawn, broadcasting live updates about the fallen hero, filming as family friends dropped off casseroles that no one had the appetite to eat, while others who had waved to them just yesterday now crossed the street to avoid walking past their house. Reporters ambushed her younger sister trying to walk to school until their neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, started driving the 12-year-old himself. Destiny could hear snippets of conversation from the officers walking past her cell, their words cutting deeper than they knew. "Remember how she went in through the window instead of the front door," one would say, while another responded, "Seems awful convenient that she knew exactly where the bedroom was, having been in that house so many times before." The implications clear in their tone. Even the presumption of innocence seemed to have gone up in smoke with Mrs. Henderson's house. Her court-appointed defender, Maria Rodriguez, no relation to their kind neighbor, had spent an hour with her that morning taking notes and looking increasingly troubled as Destiny tried to explain through her still painful throat how the smoke had guided her decisions that night, how the only thing on her mind had been reaching Mrs. Henderson, how she hadn't even known about the sapphire necklace until the detectives mentioned it. But Maria had been honest with her too, explaining how the prosecution was already building their case, how Timothy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson and rising star in the district attorney's office, was pushing for maximum charges, how the timing of her rescue and the missing jewelry, combined with her family's financial situation, created what they called compelling circumstantial evidence. The word circumstantial stuck in Destiny's mind like a thorn, each piece of her heroism being twisted into something sinister by those who had already decided her guilt. Maria Rodriguez sat in her cramped office at the public defender's building, the clock on her desk showing well past midnight, empty coffee cups and takeout containers scattered amongst the mounting pile of case files that threatened to overwhelm her small desk. The Destiny Williams case had consumed her every waking moment for the past week. Something about it just didn't sit right with her instincts honed by 15 years of defending the wrongly accused. The security footage from the night of the fire played on her laptop for what felt like the 100th time. She had requested recordings from every house within a 2-block radius of Mrs. Henderson's home. Most had been useless, showing only the gathering crowd or the arrival of emergency services, but the camera mounted on Mr. Peterson's house across the street had captured something that kept drawing her attention back again and again. Taking another sip of cold coffee, Maria leaned closer to the screen, her tired eyes burning as she focused on the background of the frame, while the main action showed Destiny emerging from the house with Mrs. Henderson. Something moved in the shadows, a flicker of movement that seemed deliberate, rather than the chaos of emergency response. Squinting, she adjusted the brightness and contrast settings, thankful for the forensics course she had taken last summer. There in the grainy footage barely visible through the smoke and emergency lights, two figures darted between the houses, their movements purposeful and practiced. As they disappeared into the darkness, Maria sat up straighter, her heart beginning to race as she rewound the footage, playing it again at half speed. The timestamp showed these movements occurred exactly when everyone was focused on Destiny's dramatic rescue, the perfect time for someone else to slip in unnoticed. Pulling out the police report, Maria scanned through the witness statements, finding what she was looking for in the testimony of Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to Mrs. Henderson. She mentioned hearing what sounded like breaking glass from the back of the house, but assumed it was from the fire. Reaching for her phone, Maria dialed the number of her friend in the forensics department despite the late hour. "Sarah, it's Maria. I need a favor. Can you enhance some security footage for me, focusing on the background, specifically around timestamp 1847. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour as they worked together to clean up the footage frame by frame, until finally Maria found herself staring at a clear image of two faces she recognized all too well: Brad Cooper and James Mitchell Sr., sons of the town council president and the chief of police, respectively. Her hands trembled as she pulled up their files on her computer, their juvenile records sealed, but not to someone who knew where to look. A string of suspicious incidents all quietly disappeared or explained away: broken windows at the community center, blamed on storm damage; missing equipment from the school gym, written off as inventory errors; cash missing from the church collection plate, assumed to be a counting mistake, but never any consequences, never any real investigation. The pieces started falling into place in Maria's mind: the timing, the method, the way the investigation had focused so quickly and completely on Destiny without exploring other possibilities. She began pulling up property records for the surrounding area, discovering that 3 other houses in the neighborhood had reported break-ins over the past month, all during community events when attention was focused elsewhere. Dawn was breaking outside her office window as Maria compiled her evidence, her eyes burning from exhaustion, but her mind racing with possibilities. She thought about Destiny sitting in a jail cell while these boys walked free, about Mrs. Henderson, confused and medicated, being manipulated into accusing her savior, about a system that was so quick to believe the worst about a young black girl while overlooking the obvious suspects because of their family connections. Reaching for her phone again, Maria dialed Destiny's parents' number, knowing they would be awake. They hadn't slept much either since their daughter was arrested. "We need to move fast," she said as soon as they answered. "I found something that changes everything, but we need to be careful about how we present it. The Coopers and Mitchells have a lot of influence in this town, and they're not going to like what I discovered." The Cedar Grove courthouse buzzed with tension as the trial entered its third day, every seat in the gallery filled with spectators who seemed to hold their breath collectively as Maria Rodriguez approached the podium, her weathered briefcase containing evidence that would shake the small town to its core. Destiny sat at the defense table, her school uniform replaced by a conservative blue dress her mother had borrowed from a cousin, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. District Attorney Timothy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson, stood at the prosecution table, his expensive suit and confident smirk reflecting his certainty in easy conviction, but Maria noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he shuffled his papers. Something about her demeanor must have telegraphed that today would be different. Judge Martinez settled into her chair, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the packed courtroom. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I would like to present new evidence that has recently come to light," handling the digitally enhanced security footage to the bailiff to be displayed on the courtroom screens. The prosecution objects. D.A. Henderson cut in his voice, carrying a note of panic that hadn't been there before. "This evidence was provided during discovery." Maria smiled slightly as she responded, "The evidence was only processed by the crime lab last night, as your office would know if they had bothered to check their email this morning." Judge Martinez nodded, allowing the footage to proceed, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs as the enhanced video began to play, showing not only Destiny's heroic rescue, but also the clear images of Brad Cooper and James Mitchell Jr. slipping through the back of Mrs. Henderson's property. In the gallery, Brad and James shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their fathers, the town council president and police chief, exchanging worried glances as Maria continued her presentation. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence linking these 2 individuals to a string of burglaries in the Cedar Grove area, all coinciding with community events or emergencies that would draw attention elsewhere." She produced a detailed timeline matching the boys' movements to each incident. But the bombshell came when Maria called her surprise witness, Officer Sarah Chen from the forensics department, who had helped enhance the footage, stepped forward to testify about finding trace evidence at previous crime scenes that matched items found in Brad Cooper's bedroom, including fragments of glass with specific tool marks matching the broken window at Mrs. Henderson's house. Officer Chen spoke clearly despite the glares from her superior, the police chief. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Maria played audio recordings from Mr. Peterson's security system capturing conversations between Brad and James as they planned to use the fire as cover for their theft, discussing how easy it would be to blame any missing items on the confusion of the rescue. James Mitchell Sar stood up, his face red with anger, but Judge Martinez silenced him with a sharp rap of her gavel. Destiny felt tears rolling down her cheeks as the truth finally emerged in the witness box. Mrs. Henderson, who had been called back to testify, stared in shock at the footage, her hands trembling as she realized how she had been manipulated into accusing her young neighbor, the same girl who had risked everything to save her life. The elderly woman turned to look at Destiny, her eyes filled with shame and regret. Timothy Henderson attempted to maintain control of his case, arguing procedural points and trying to suppress the new evidence, but with each objection overruled, his voice grew weaker, his earlier confidence evaporating as the weight of truth pressed down on the prosecution. The tables had turned so completely that even the most skeptical observers could no longer deny Destiny's innocence. As Maria presented her final piece of evidence, a detailed analysis of Brad and James' criminal history that had been covered up by their powerful parents, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tension to outrage. The same community members who had been quick to condemn Destiny now turned their anger toward the real perpetrators and the system that had protected them for so long. Some began to leave the courtroom, unable to watch as their town's carefully maintained facade of equality and justice crumbled before their eyes. Judge Martinez listened to the evidence, her expression growing sterner with each revelation until finally she held up her hand, silencing the courtroom. This case, she declared, her voice ringing with authority, has become about much more than a single incident of theft. It has exposed a pattern of privilege and prejudice that cannot be ignored. She turned to the district attorney. I am ordering an immediate investigation into all prior cases involving these defendants and the handling of evidence by the Cedar Grove Police Department. The afternoon sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the now nearly empty courtroom as Mrs. Henderson made her way slowly to where Destiny sat, her walker clicking softly against the polished floor. The elderly woman looked smaller, somehow diminished by the weight of her guilt, her usual elegant posture bent with shame as she approached the young girl who had saved her life only to face such terrible accusations. Destiny rose to meet her former neighbor, uncertain of what to say or do in this moment that felt both fragile and monumental. Her mother stepped back, giving them space, while Maria Rodriguez watched from her table, quietly gathering her papers. The evidence that had cleared Destiny's name still displayed on the courtroom screens behind them, frozen on the image that had changed everything. My dear sweet girl, Mrs. Henderson began, her voice breaking as she reached for Destiny's hands. How could I have ever doubted you? The same hands that pulled me from the fire, that saved not just my life, but the photos of my Henry, the only memories I have left of him. Tears rolled down her weathered cheeks, leaving tracks through her carefully applied makeup. I was so confused that night, the smoke and the medication they gave me at the hospital, everything was jumbled in my mind. Destiny felt her own eyes fill with tears as the past weeks of fear, anger, and hurt began to melt away, replaced by understanding and relief. She remembered how many times Mrs. Henderson had stood up for her over the years, how she had been the first person in the neighborhood to welcome her family, how she had taught Destiny to make her famous peach cobbler, passing down her secret recipe that Shed brought from Georgia all those years ago. The stolen sapphire necklace lay in an evidence bag on Maria's table, recovered from Brad Cooper's bedroom, along with other pieces of jewelry taken from houses across town. Mrs. Henderson glanced at it, then turned back to Destiny. They tried to steal my memories, but you saved the most precious thing of all. She pulled the slightly smoke-damaged photo album from her large purse. Henry would have been so proud of you, just as I should have been from the start. In the gallery, Destiny's father wiped tears from his eyes as he watched his daughter embrace the elderly woman who had caused them so much pain, yet whose own pain and manipulation by others was now so clear. Television cameras rolled quietly from the back of the courtroom, capturing this moment of healing, but for once their presence felt respectful, rather than intrusive, as if even the most cynical reporters recognized the importance of what they were witnessing. Judge Martinez remained at her bench watching the scene unfold before her. In all her years on the bench, she had rarely seen such a pure moment of reconciliation, such a clear example of how justice served could heal rather than divide. She thought of her own granddaughter, not much younger than Destiny, and felt a surge of emotion for all the young people who faced prejudice and assumptions every day. Outside the courthouse, they could hear the sounds of protest as supporters of the Cooper and Mitchell families clashed with those demanding accountability and change. But in this moment, there was only understanding and forgiveness. Mrs. Henderson reached into her purse, again pulling out a small velvet box that looked aged and well-loved. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver locket. "And now I want you to have it." But Mrs. Henderson Destiny started to protest, only to be silenced by the elderly woman's gentle smile. "This isn't about guilt or making amends, though heaven knows I have much to make up for. This is about recognizing true family, the kind that isn't bound by blood, but by love and trust and faith in each other, even when the whole world tries to tell you otherwise." She carefully placed the chain around Destiny's neck, her hands trembling slightly. Maria approached quietly, holding out a document for both of them to see, the official record showing all charges dropped and Destiny's name cleared. But more than that, it contained Judge Martinez's ruling ordering a full investigation into the pattern of privilege and corruption that had allowed Brad and James to operate with impunity for so long. Mrs. Henderson squared her shoulders as she read it, then looked up with determination in her eyes. "I want to help," she declared. "I want to testify about everything I know about how Timothy and others have protected those boys all these years." 1 year after the fire that changed everything, Cedar Grove had become a different place. The old Victorian house on Maple Street stood restored, its fresh paint and rebuilt porch a testament to the community that had come together to rebuild it, not just as Mrs. Henderson's home, but as the newly established Cedar Grove Youth Center, a place where young people from all backgrounds could gather, learn, and grow together. Destiny stood on that porch, now wearing her Harvard acceptance letter like a badge of honor, as she helped younger students with their homework. The scholarship committee had been particularly moved by her personal essay about truth, justice, and the power of community to either perpetuate prejudice or overcome it. The same qualities that had once made her a target of suspicion had become the foundation of her strength and leadership. Inside the youth center, Mrs. Henderson moved between groups of children, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, as she shared stories of civil rights history with eager listeners, her experiences both past and recent lending weight and urgency to her words. The investigation sparked by Judge Martinez's ruling had led to significant changes in Cedar Grove. The police chief and town council president had resigned their positions following the exposure of years of corruption and cover-ups. Brad Cooper and James Mitchell had faced justice for their crimes. Their sentencing hearing had drawn national attention as an example of privilege finally being held accountable. Their father's attempts to protect them had only led to further charges and investigations revealing a deep network of corruption that had infected the town's power structure for generations. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations about bias, prejudice, and the true meaning of justice. The walls of the youth center displayed artwork created by local students exploring themes of identity, justice, and community healing. Maria Rodriguez now served on the newly established Civilian Oversight Committee for the police department, her experience with Destiny's case having inspired her to push for broader systemic change. She often stopped by to mentor young aspiring lawyers, particularly those from marginalized communities who saw their own potential reflected in her success. Timothy Henderson had resigned from the district attorney's office, his role in perpetuating bias and protecting privilege having destroyed his once promising career, but his departure had opened the door for reform-minded prosecutors who understood the importance of equal justice under law. The sapphire necklace that had once nearly destroyed an innocent girl's life now sat in a display case at the youth center, alongside other artifacts telling the story of Cedar Grove's transformation. Destiny's father had been appointed to the reconstructed town council, his quiet wisdom and commitment to fairness making him an ideal voice for the changing community. Her mother led workshops on advocacy and community organizing, teaching others how to stand up for justice, even when the system seemed stacked against them. Her younger sister now led the youth center's peer mentoring program, helping other young people navigate the challenges of growing up in a world still learning to overcome its prejudices. Local businesses that had once pulled their support from Destiny's family now competed to offer internships and opportunities to youth center participants. The same social media platforms that had once spread rumors and accusations now showcase stories of collaboration and progress between communities that had previously lived separate lives divided by invisible but powerful lines of race and class. Mrs. Henderson and Destiny had developed a tradition of baking together every Thursday afternoon just like before, but now they were joined by eager students learning not just recipes but life lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the courage to stand up for truth. The smell of peach cobbler still filled the kitchen, but it mingled now with the sounds of laughter and conversation in multiple languages as children from all parts of town found common ground in shared experiences. The silver locket that Mrs. Henderson had given Destiny rarely left her neck. Inside it, she kept a small photo of the two of them taken on the day the youth center opened, their smiles reflecting not just personal healing but hope for the future. Destiny often found herself touching it when speaking to groups about her experience, drawing strength from the reminder that even the darkest moments could lead to light. As the sun began to set over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the youth center's porch, Destiny watched a new group of children arrive for evening programs, their parents chatting comfortably across old dividing lines. She thought about how a single act of courage, entering a burning building to save a life, had sparked a fire of different kind, one that had burned away old prejudices and forged new bonds in their place. The town would never be perfect, but it had learned valuable lessons about justice, truth, and the power of standing together in the face of adversity.